Hi, I'm Davin, and this is a series about making the Silver Cord Show, where we have some interviews with the people behind making the series, and in these early stages, the people who made the trailer. And I'd like to start by introducing my friend, Mr. Adam Killick. How are you doing, sir?
I am well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very good. Adam, tell them what you did on the Silver Cord teaser.
I just dragged a bunch of files into an editor and let them do their own thing.
Perfect, and
No,
we're done.
yes, that's it. That's good.
What's your title for this type of work? What would you call yourself as a professional?
Head of catering.
Sorry?
Head of catering?
Head of catering. Right. The
Yes.
food was fantastic. Mostly
But
great.
besides that, sound design and sound effects editing.
Sound design, sound effects editing. Now, I've heard other titles. There's like sound mixer, there's dialogue editor, there's sound designer. Which of these is kind of where you fall, and what's your favorite sort of work that you like to do for your career?
Well, I'm kind of a small boutique studio, so I kind of tend to do a lot of things. I'd like to call myself a sound designer. That's the most fun part of it, is kind of coming up with, looking at a scene and trying to come up with sounds that create the emotion that underscores that scene. But yeah, in this case, I'm also the editor and the mixer and the masterer. But I mean, it's a job that in a full feature film would be split between a dozen people,
Right. Yeah, but full service on this one because we're starting small.
starting small.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the first steps between you and I coming up with the sound design for the trailer. So take us through just some of those early phases. When was the first time you sort of heard about what we were up to, and what did you first receive when you were starting to think about the sound design for Silvercord?
Well, it's funny, right? Because I mean, I had seen the early versions of the trailer, and I was just gonna, on my own, kind of have a go at making some sound design for it because the early version just had the music, and so that was the version that I saw first when you sent it to me. It was scored beautifully, but it was lacking a bit of sort of depth, if I might say that. So I sort of saw my job as to kind of add a bit of emotional resonance to what was already an emotionally driving score.
Right. And the score originally, it was one of the first things that was lined up for the trailer. If you're wondering what we're talking about, it's the sort of the violins and the choir singing, if you will. That was put in first, and then actually the trailer was storyboarded to that music. But this was a very early version of the trailer that many of you haven't seen, where there was only the music. And so when I came to you, I said, essentially, we have this piece of music in place and I like it, but we can kind of revision it, start from scratch, start thinking about what else might be a part of this. And one of the first things you did was an alternate score. Do you want to tell us a little bit about some of that music that you made?
Sure, if I could maybe just step back a little bit and talk a bit about kind of philosophy of sound
I love
kind
it.
of stuff. My view on sound in film is it's kind of like the subconscious of the film. The people are looking at a movie, they're looking at a TV show, they're looking at the visuals, and that's what you're kind of processing in kind of the front part of your mind, as I see it. The sound's job is to kind of be a bit more subversive and a bit more subconscious, if that makes sense. Like just to try to kind of draw you in a way that you might not be realizing. So it's certainly not to fight with the visuals. It's to complement the visuals, but maybe add a few things that because we're human beings and we have five senses, and in film we typically only get to use two, so we should use those two senses to the fullest. And that means kind of thinking about what the images are trying to say and coming up with how we want the person watching to respond emotionally to that, and then finding sounds that kind of help push the listener or the viewer in that direction.
Right. And so you're looking at this 2 minutes of footage that has one piece of music to it. Do you start writing ideas down? Do you start looking for sounds? How do you start gathering your thoughts and assets together?
With this one, I kind of, I watched it a dozen times or so, and then I started scribbling a few things down, and then I just went to my sound libraries and started throwing stuff up there. And, I have 1,000 different kind of we call them drones, which are kind of the low hums in the background, or risers, where it's a rising pitch, swells, which kind of rise up and come down again. They're all kind of loosely orchestral, but they're often, they're just a single note or a single series of notes as opposed to a completed score, which is a continuous piece of music. So the first part is just to kind of get that sort of background tone that complements, it's in the same key as the score, and, just kind of fills it out a bit more. And then being very careful about picking some individual sounds that will ring out without overwhelming the viewer, because we don't want, the last thing the sound editor wants or the designer wants is to have people notice the sound in a way that takes away from the visual experience.
So how do you balance that? What are the sort of knobs that you're tweaking when you're trying to have something that will resonate with an audience member, but also sit somewhat in the background? So how do you? What are the types of things that you're playing with when you're figuring out how to put something into a mix?
Tone mainly, and you know, you kind of start with maybe putting sound with everything, and then you start pulling it back. So until it's kind of brought down to the essence of what you need. I'm a big believer in not overdoing things. So kind of, in a way, I sort of see it as, if you remember the way Alfred Hitchcock made movies, he didn't have fancy visual effects. He relied entirely on kind of using sort of subtle things to create tension in the screen. And that's the job that I sort of see the sound being these days, because visual effects are so good. So, there's areas where, maybe there's a hint of sound just to give people a touch, and there's some areas where you really want to emphasize a scene change or something like that. So for example, she's hitting the chord with a rock, and you can hear sort of a bit of squishy sounds because it's umbilical.
A sacrifice.
But then it's still in the background until she does that one big hit, and then that signifies a big change in the scene. So we put in a lot of kind of, I was out in my backyard with a giant rock, hitting it on various textures to kind of combine them together into one sound. Then added some kind of reverb to it, and just to make it sound kind of like, to make it very clear to the viewer that now there's a scene change coming and pay attention.
Right. What are some of the aside from the juicy rock smash? What are some of the other juicy bits that are in there? What are some of the other pieces of sound that, if a listener was to go back and re-listen to the trailer, that you'd want to point out and say, keep an ear out for this because this is interesting. Give us a peek into some of the stuff that's a little bit hidden that you might miss on the first listen.
Well, at times it's actually, we tried to make it so that it's hard to differentiate the scoring from the background, so that the background completely matches. So initially, I pulled a bunch of sounds that I thought would be useful out of the library, but they weren't pitched right, so I had to kind of lower them in pitch. Some of the sounds I actually made with my own voice, and then used a sampler to kind of, mix around with it and kind of change its tone. So, there's, for example, there's actually the sound of her walking is in there, but it's very, very, very low in the mix. So you have really good headphones to hear it, but it's just to give somebody who does catch it kind of a little hint that there's motion going on, because the music and the visuals are really carrying it at that stage. So it's little elements like that. And the other thing that have become very common in trailers recent years, thanks to the composer Hans Zimmer. They're called Brahms, and they were really first used to good effect in the movie Inception, and how everybody kind of uses them. But they're kind of like, they're called Brahms because that's what it's a Brahm, like a big beating drum, a great drum beat that has a long tail. So for instance, when she falls into the well, there's a Brahm there. So if you listen, you'll hear it. There's another one when the fireball kind of explodes towards her. And so, and I sort of, the whole idea is like, what would something sound like if there was no music. So when I'm working, I don't have the scoring on. I just have the visuals, and then so there's this fireball, and then what would that sound? What would raining fire down on somebody sound like? And you may not notice it in the final mix because there's a lot of music, and then, as I mentioned, there's the other things like the background drones and risers in there. But there's this sound of what I thought like the wind gusting through a forest fire might sound like, as she's pressing herself, kind of retreating against the well before she falls in.
Yeah, I love that. There is a sense in that trailer where the sound of the fireball picks up before you see the fireball. I always love that when audio can maybe drive a question in the mind of
Yeah.
the viewer before the visual arrives. So you're wondering, what is that thing that has obviously just lit itself somewhere in this environment? And then the character wonders as well, and then both of you learn at the same time.
Right. Well, it's the go. As you can see, she's kind of looking over her shoulder in anticipation of something, and so there's obviously something happened. And in my interpretation of that, it was this sort of eruption, almost like a volcanic eruption of a fireball, and that's off screen, but the sound helps put it kind of in the expanded canvas of the viewer's mind, if that makes sense.
The last thing I want to talk about just before I let you be for the day is a little bit about the process between a director, myself, and yourself. How many iterations did we do? What's sort of the feedback process on notes? How did that work for you? What was kind of the experience of fine-tuning the bits to get to the final product?
Well, that's good. I mean, I think we worked well together, and I mean, it's different right now because of COVID. In a normal situation, you and I would have been in the same room on a screen and playing it, and we could have tweaked things kind of while we watched it. We actually tried to do that over Zoom, where we both were watching it at the same time, and it was a bit tricky. But yeah, I'm just kind of throwing down. I'm just kind of throwing out ideas. I'm throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks, and we gradually refine it down from that. And you were very good at providing feedback and very clear about what you liked and what you didn't like. And it's not really a place to get too much ego involved because ultimately you're the director, it's your project, and I'm just there kind of working for you. So if you at one point we had put a fairly heavy reverb onto Angela's voice, and it sounded really impressive in my studio where I've got big speakers and it kind of floor shaking bass, but I recognize that on many other devices it wouldn't sound as impressive, so we got rid of that at your suggestion, which was, I think, a good suggestion. And that's another thing that is we have to talk about is that people watch things differently today than they did 10 years ago.
And so do you design with that in mind, the fact that a lot of people will watch on mobile, some people on iPads, some people on an amazing 5.1 surround sound? Like, how do you balance the fact that there's so many different ways people could listen to it?
Well, I mean, yeah, I'm still going to try to make it sound as good as I can for somebody listening with the best technology, but then there are certain elements that will sound overwrought on an iPhone speaker, so we have to scale those back a bit. We kind of have to. It's a tricky sort of line of best fit, because you don't want to disappoint the people who have the investment in really good, technology, but we also have to recognize that the kind of bulk of people don't, and we have to kind of make sure that it sounds good to everybody, and that's a difficult balance sometimes.
Well, Adam, it was a real pleasure working with you on this one. I remember there was one night where we were talking on the phone about some of the first round of notes. And I was on my way to Shoppers Drug Mart, which closed at 10. And I looked at my watch and it was 9:45. And I'm like, okay, we could do this call before Shoppers closes. And I got on the horn with you and we started talking. We started talking about sound and all kinds of movies and all these different approaches to the voice of God. And we got into so much. And by the time the call was done, I thought, maybe I could still pop in, and I looked, and we'd been talking for an hour. And Shoppers had closed for 45 minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know that.
I've been standing on the corner, but it's just to give you an idea of how fascinating it is to talk about sound on these projects. That time flies when you're having fun, and I appreciate all your efforts. Thank you so much, Mr. Adam Killick, the sound designer, sound mixer for the Silver Cord teaser. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Hopefully, we get to do it again.
Hopefully.